Today we're going to talk about the nervous system. This is lecture 1 of 2. The human body can be compared to the supercomputer of the human body. The nervous system and the endocrine system are the main major control and integrating systems of the human body. Neurology means the study of the normal functioning and disorders of the nervous system. The components of the nervous system include the central nervous system, or CNS, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, which will include the cranial nerves that exit the brain, the spinal nerves that exit the spinal cord, the ganglia, the enteric plexus in the gastrointestinal system, and sensory receptors that we've discussed in the past that exist in the skin. So let's look at the organization of the nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system will include the cranial nerves, and there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves that exit the brain, and there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves that exit the spinal cord. The ganglia are masses of nervous tissue primarily made up of neuronal cell bodies. They're located outside the brain and the spinal cord. The enteric plexus, they're a network of neurons that are located in the walls of the gastrointestinal system, and they help regulate the digestive system. We'll discuss this in greater detail when we discuss the digestive system, or the brain of the gut. Sensory receptors are structures that monitor changes in the internal and the external environment. The definition of nerve, which we'll talk about to a great extent, is a bundle of axons and their connective tissue and blood vessels that are located outside the central nervous system. So the three main functions of the nervous system are sensory, which detects stimuli; integrative function, which analyzes and it's the perception of this information; and the motor function, which is the movement. So let's look at these in more detail. So sensory function detects internal and external stimuli via neurons or nerve cells. And these neurons that are bringing the information into the central nervous system are called sensory or afferent neurons. They carry the information into the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. So in this example, this man is looking at a glass of water and he's thinking, I'm thirsty, I would like to drink some water. So that information is coming in is called an afferent neuron or a sensory neuron. So I like to use the mnemonic add. So an afferent or a sensory neuron is adding that information into the CNS. So once it reaches the central nervous system, it's going to have an integrative function. So that means it's processing this incoming information, like what am I going to do with it? So those are called interneurons. These neurons, the green one here, are called interneurons. So they're responsible for the analysis, storing, making decision on the correct response of that afferent or sensory information that came in. So they're the awareness of the stimuli or perception of this information. The last one is called motor function. So the motor function is after this information has been integrated, then we want a reaction, and the type of neuron that brings this information out are called efferent neurons or motor neurons. they're carrying the information outside for a reaction. So in this case, efferent neuron is this one. So I like to use the mnemonic exit. Exit. So then after it's been integrated, so this is an afferent neuron, this is an efferent neuron, this is an interneuron. So the efferent neuron, after the information has been analyzed and determined what reaction, we want to stimulate our skeletal muscle to lift the glass of water so we can drink and satisfy our thirst. So the efferent or motor neurons carry the information out from the central nervous system to the effectors, whether it be muscles or glands. So again, reviewing this information, here's, let's say it's a pain receptor. There's a pinch here. So this neuron bringing it into the central nervous system is an afferent neuron. It goes through the dorsal root ganglion. This is where the cell body of this afferent sensory neuron exists. And then it's going to connect to the interneuron in the central nervous system for perception or integration of the information. And then it's going to exit via an efferent neuron or a motor neuron, or exiting to stimulate, for example, the skeletal muscle to take our hand away from the noxious or painful stimuli. So the other thing I want you to note, and let's start memorizing this, dorsal root, meaning a posterior root. Remember when we discussed areas? So posterior is dorsal, ventral is anterior, okay? So the information is coming into the spinal cord via the dorsal root or posterior part of the spinal cord. The interneuron is within the gray matter of the spinal cord, and then the reaction is exiting the ventral or anterior portion of the spinal cord. So let's look at the functional organization of the nervous system. So I have several images of this. If I were you, I would write out these charts so you can understand the organization of the nervous system. So the processing or integrative area is called the central nervous system. So that includes the brain and the gut. Information coming in is called the sensory input. Remember, this would be an afferent neuron, is adding information into the central nervous system. So what's bringing this information in? Obviously, sensory receptors from sensory receptors responding to external stimuli. It could be coming from the skin, muscle, and joints, and also input from our viscera or internal organs. So that's the sensory information coming in. And then the information exiting, or the reaction to this information, will be an efferent neuron, or exiting. So this is the central nervous system, and all of this down here is the peripheral nervous system. So then the motor output can go in two different directions. One could be the somatic nervous system directs voluntary movements, or it could go to the autonomic nervous system. So voluntary is where you consciously can decide to move it, usually stimulating our skeletal muscles. In the examples we've talked about in the past, the motor neuron can stimulate your skeletal muscle, for example, to fracture muscles in your upper limb to lift the glass of water and drink. The other one is called the autonomic nervous system. So these are systems that are associated with a lot of our vital activities, such as heart rate, breathing. We don't really think about that. They're autonomically controlled. And then this is further divided into a parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic is considered our rest and digest, or calming things down, where our sympathetic is more of a fight or flight portion of the autonomic nervous system. So this is a similar diagram. So here is the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. We've got somatic sensory receptors and somatic sensory neurons bringing information in. And then we have the somatic voluntary nervous system stimulating our skeletal muscles, which is all under voluntary control. Then we have the autonomic nervous system, which we don't really think about, but occurs. So this is bringing information from the viscera, sensory organs. So they're called the visceral sensory receptors and sensory neurons. So this is bringing information in from our internal environment. And then it's going to stimulate the autonomic nervous system or the involuntary nervous system associated with our sympathetics and parasympathetic nervous system. So this is going to control muscles, which include our smooth muscles. Smooth muscles exist in our digestive system. It also exists in our blood vessels. They're also going to stimulate the cardiac muscles and glands, which are all under involuntary control. Part of this autonomic nervous system is called the enteric motor neurons. They're involuntary in the enteric plexus. So the enteric sensory receptors are bringing information from our gastrointestinal tract and the enteric plexus. And the reaction of this is going to stimulate the smooth muscle and glands and endocrine cells of our gastrointestinal system. So here's a third little chart that I like for its clarity. I would recommend you draw this out a few times so you can understand the divisions, the organization to a greater extent. So here's our CNS, the brain, and the spinal cord. Okay. So the red is the information exit, the green is the blue is information coming into the central nervous system. Here is the peripheral nervous system that we've talked about. So first of all, the peripheral nervous system is going to include our cranial nerves and spinal nerves, and information from the sensory or afferent division is going to bring somatic and visceral sensory information into the central nervous system for a reaction. The reaction is going to exit our motor or efferent division, and this is further divided into a somatic nervous system, which is under voluntary control, and that's going to control our skeletal muscles, versus the autonomic nervous system, which controls the autonomic portion of the nervous system, which is going to stimulate our smooth muscles, our glands, and our cardiac muscles. The motor efferent division of the autonomic nervous system is further divided into a sympathetic, which mobilizes flight or fight activities, or it's going to control the parasympathetic nervous system, which is going to calm things out or rest and digest. So information is coming in through our sensory fibers of our skin, visceral sensory fibers from our viscera or our organs, and then it's going to react via the somatic nervous system controlling our skeletals, which is under voluntary control, or it's going to stimulate under the autonomic nervous system, for example, our heart and bladder. So the sympathetics is going to increase the heart rate. Parasympathetics will calm things out and stimulating the bladder to urinate. So the peripheral nervous system has sensory afferent neurons. which is going to bring, again, so these are afferent neurons. They're bringing information to the central nervous system. And then we have motor efferent neurons, which are transporting the information from the CNS to muscles or glands. So the three major subdivisions are the somatic nervous system. Somatic, you'll know it's voluntary. So these somatic sensory neurons are bringing information into the nervous system, or afferent neurons. They're conveying information from sensory receptors, which can include our skin, skeletal muscles, joints, special senses, hearing, equilibrium. That's bringing the information in. In the CNS, that information is going to be integrated. And then it's going to, the reaction is going to exit the central nervous system via the efferent or somatic motor neurons. This is under voluntary control, so these are going to stimulate our skeletal muscles. The peripheral nervous system is under autonomic control, meaning it's involuntary. The autonomic nervous system, part of the peripheral nervous system, is under involuntary control. So these neurons are coming in, they're called autonomic sensory neurons. They're bringing information from the visceral receptors into the central nervous system. These could be organs from the heart, the GI, the pelvic organs, and then the reaction is going to exit out the autonomic nervous system. So this information is going to be carried to our smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. And there's the motor portion of this autonomic nervous system has two branches. The sympathetic, which is our fight or flight responses, or the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest functions. So let's look at this in a little more detail. So rest and digest is the parasympathetics, and fight and flight would be the sympathetics. So the sympathetic nervous system is also known as the thoracodorsal nervous system. What does that stimulate? It stimulates, it's very stimulating. So fight or flight is what is going to allow us to like run away or protect. So our pupils are going to dilate, heart rate's going to increase. It's going to elevate blood pressure, so we need to bring blood to all our muscles if we're going to run. Airways dilate. There's constriction of blood vessels, especially to the kidneys, GI tract, and dilate blood vessels to muscles and liver. So we want to bring more blood to the muscles and decrease the blood where it's not as necessary, like our GI tract and the kidneys. Therefore, if you're having lunch and you want to digest properly, it's always recommended that you're resting, not like you're driving on the expressway trying to eat a hamburger and on the phone, fighting with your teenager. Versus the parasympathetics is considered the cranial sacral, because that's where the nuclei originate, and the mnemonic SLUD. So this is going to stimulate a lot of our digestive capacity, which includes salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, and defecation. The third one is the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is considered the brain of the gut. So it's a little separate little nervous system located in the walls of the gastrointestinal system, which assists with the digestive capacity that autonomically occurs in the GI tract. So it has sensory neurons, which monitors changes in the GI tract, such as stretching walls. So it's carrying information in. And then it has motor neurons that cause the contraction of our GI tract, assisting in the movement of the food through the intestines. Also stimulates the secretions, stomach acids, and endocrine cells to secrete hormones. So it's carrying information out, and this regulates our digestive activity, and this is involuntary. So this is an overview. Again, I think I've given you enough diagrams. So here's the CNS, the processing center. What's coming in? Somatic nervous system, under voluntary control, autonomic nervous system, and then the enteric nervous system. It's going to be processed in the central nervous system. So what's going to carry this information to its reaction? Somatic motor neurons. When you see somatic, you'll know it's voluntary, and this is going to stimulate our skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system is going to exit via an autonomic motor neurons, which either could be stimulatory, which is the sympathetic, or calming, which is the parasympathetic. And this is going to stimulate our smooth muscles, our cardiac muscles, and our glands. And then we have a separate little brain of the gut here. It's going to, it can go to the central nervous system, but it does not have to. And this stimulates our enteric motor neurons, which is involuntary. And this exists in this enteric plexus of the gut, meaning like a little separate nervous system that exists there. And it's going to stimulate smooth muscles and glands and endocrine cells in the gastrointestinal system. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the histology of a neuron. So as we discussed in cells, the nerve cell or the neuron has similar characteristics. So this is considered the cell body, and within the cell body, we have familiar structures that we've discussed in the past. It has a nucleus, which would be the brain of the neuron. It also has cytoplasm within the cell body, has mitochondria, or the powerhouse of the cells. There's some new structures we're going to talk about. Dendrites. These are the dendrites, or these little branch structures. And this is the receiving portion of the information coming from outside the nerve cell. It also has Nissl bodies. See these little dark structures? And what Nissl bodies are actually, they are rough endoplasmic reticulum. We'll go over this in a minute. And they are the rough endoplasmic reticulum of our neuron. This process exiting the information away from the cell body is called the axon. And then at the end are the terminal axons with the synaptic end bulb. So the information is going to exit at this end. Then the other part of the nerve cell or the neuron are glia. And we'll discuss glia. They are smaller than neurons, and they're the supporting tissue that exists in between the neurons. Their function is to support and nourish the neuron, and they're actively dividing, where the neuron itself has very limited capacity to regenerate. So let's look at a neuron slide. You could see the neuron cell body. This would be the nucleus. The tissue out here, or the supporting tissue, is what we call the neuroglia. There's more neuroglia than neurons, and we'll discuss these in greater detail. So the neuron cells are the circuitry connecting all regions of the body of the nervous system. Some certain characteristics of the neuron is that it has electrical excitability. What does that mean? It's that it has the ability to respond to a stimulus and converts this stimulus to an action potential or a nerve impulse. Neurons are highly specialized, and neurons mostly have an inability to regenerate. Definitely in the CNS, somewhat in the PNS, they can regenerate, very limited as long as the cell body is intact. The supporting tissue of the nerve tissue is called the neuroglia. And neuroglia are smaller but more outnumber the neurons. Their function is to support and nourish and protect neurons, and they continue to divide through an individual's lifetime. So let's look at this again. Here's the cell body. We've also called this soma here. So the cell body will have the nucleus. Okay, and then within the nucleus are the familiar structures, the nucleolus, there's microtubules. Throughout, we have the Nissl bodies, which are the rough endoplasmic reticulum of the nerve cell. It has the Golgi apparatus. We see ribosomes around. And then here's the axon and the dendrites, which are the receiving portion of the action potential. And then this is going to go through the nerve cell body, and this action potential or stimulus is going to travel away from the cell body through the axon out into the synaptic vesicles or at the axon terminals, and we'll talk about the synapse in greater detail. So let's look at all this in greater detail. So the cell body have the familiar structures that we've had in the cells, like the cytoplasm, typical organelles, lysosomes, mitochondria, Golgi complex, which packages, processes proteins. So the Nissl bodies are the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So what do we know about rough endoplasmic reticulum? This is where we produce proteins in the ribosomes. That's why they're rough endoplasmic reticulum. Within the Nissl bodies, we have what's called the cytoskeleton, and in the neurons, they're called the neurofibrils. So these support the cell, provide shape and structural and support of the nerve cell body. Other structural integrity organelles are microtubules, and there's some somatic granules, and the purpose of these are to increase the surface area for nerve cell interaction. So as we move away from the cell body, the nerve fibers include the dendrites. So the dendrites are short and highly branched with dendritic spines, which increase the surface area to receive signals. So the important thing about the dendrites is they're the receiving signal part of the neuron. And they're varied in shape depending on what type of neuron exists. So they're the receiving portion of the action potential. And they're going to set this potential through the cell body into the axons. So as you can see in this image, this is a dendrite, and it's connected to the receiving portion from other neurons. So generally, what's connecting to this is an axon of another neuron. And we'll discuss how this particular neuron or nerve cell, this would be the postsynaptic neuron, and this would be the presynaptic neuron. So other characteristics, we know now that the dendrites are the receiving portion from another neuron. This action potential is going to go through the cell body, and then it's going to go to the axon hillock. So what's the axon hillock? That's the portion of the cell body that is going to trigger this action potential into the axons. If we look at the axon, we notice these little cells, which are areas of what we call myelination. Okay, myelination will actually protect and coat the axon, and we see Schwann cells primarily in the peripheral nervous system. So when we see a Schwann cell, we know where we're at. So this is the peripheral nervous system, because in the peripheral nervous system, we have Schwann cells that myelinate the axons. In between the Schwann cells, we have these little separations called nodes of Ranvier. So what this does is it permits that action potential to flow quicker down the axon before it reaches the axon terminal. So the axon is carrying the nerve impulse away from the cell body. The axon hillock is where it connects to the neuron cell body. The initial segment is part of this action segment which contains the trigger zone. So the trigger zone is that junction between the axon hillock and the initial segment of the axon where the impulse arises. Axoplasm is the cytoplasm of the axon. Throughout the axon, there are axon collaterals, which are side branches. Axolemma is the plasma membrane of the axon. And then the ends are the axon terminal. So these are the tips of the axons that contain the synaptic envelopes. They are all called synaptic boutons. And within the synaptic envelope, we have these varicosities, which are these little synaptic vessels that carry the neurotransmitter, which we'll discuss in the near future. The nodes of Ranvier are these gaps in between the myelin sheath, which stimulate and facilitate the conduction of the nerve impulse, which will flow quicker. So again, here is sometimes we call the cell body the soma, has the nucleus. We could axon hillock, or within that is the trigger zone, which is the action potential is stimulated and brought through the axon. In between each Schwann cell, we Ranvier, which strengthens the impulse, and then we reach these synaptic envelopes. And again, the action potential is coming in through the dendrites. It's going through the cell body or soma, and then the axon is carried away from the cell body to the axon terminals. So I'll meet you at the next video, number 2.